He ruled over death. It took him 100 years to realize that anyone who wished to live as a human should never strive to control such a force. The palace stood grand and opulent. Rows of golden pillars stretched endlessly above a marble hall, while elegant paintings and intricate sculptures adorned the walls. Yet the people who should have filled this place were absent. There was no king, no queen, no prince, no princess, not even a single servant or attendant. Technically, the king was there, along with servants and attendants, but none were human. A massive golden throne gleamed under the faint moonlight, and upon it sat a skeletal figure draped in a black robe. Skeleton murmured to itself, questioning why it had ever taken its path, followed by a deep sigh. Its shoulders slumped, and a hollow smile appeared on its skull. With no one present to hear, the monarch of death, Karnak, continued his monologue, absently lifting one bony hand. A faint blue aura gathered over his fingers, forming the shape of a human hand, the very hand that could part seas and shake the heavens with a mere wave. His skull began to take on the form of a pale, blue human face as he sighed once more. He remarked that 70 years had already passed since he had ended up like this, noting how time both flew and crawled. About 100 years prior, Karnak first encountered necromancy, the forbidden art of forbidden arts. Born as the illegitimate child of a fallen noble family, he was scorned and neglected during his upbringing. In desperation to survive, he reached for the forbidden, gaining power by fortune or misfortune. However, he paid a heavy price and strayed from humanity. He lived as an evil necromancer, battling wave after wave of enemies, striking first when possible, and killing the innocent repeatedly. The world came to despise him as he became the devil. The Central Empire of Lacania, the Western Alliance of the Seven Kingdoms, the Eastern Federation of Barris, and the Church of the Seven Goddesses all regarded him as their enemy. The entire continent, the world, stood against him, yet Karnak never retreated. He wielded the power of death to raise fallen foes as undead minions, expanding his influence further. It only fueled the flames of war, making it more brutal. The dead walked among the living, marching across the continent. Karnak became known as the monarch of death, the ultimate evil humanity could never tolerate. Humanity's final defenses crumbled. Even the 4 great martial kings, the strongest warriors alive, and the 3 archmages, known to reach the heavens with their power, fell and became servants of the monarch of death. Finally, the guardian of the world, the dragon emperor Griteria, appeared to confront Karnak. Despite his practice of every forbidden act imaginable, Karnak found no way to oppose the mighty emperor of the dragons. Karnak, a lowly human relying solely on devious tricks, could do nothing against the mightiest dragon emperor. With no other choice, he resorted to the most dreaded forbidden technique he had reserved for the end. He transformed into Astra Shunaf, the ultimate transcendental being surpassing even the strongest undead, the Death Knight and the Archlich. Thus, Karnak fully abandoned his humanity, paying an immense price. After 3 days of fierce battle, Griteria lost his honor as the Dragon Emperor. In his place stood the undead dragon Griteria, now a loyal servant of the Death Monarch. Karnak had once been nothing special, a low-born noble without heroic bloodline or divine power. Yet this mere human, lacking extraordinary lineage or divine strength, defeated legendary heroes and godlike beings to ascend the ultimate throne. The world was now entirely his. He sighed deeply as he looked once more at his hand, questioning what he could do with a body reduced to bones. Gold, jewels, graceful beauties, rare wines, cheerful songs, every luxury and pleasure imaginable meant nothing to him anymore. His dead body held no trace of human sensation. He longed to feel again, to taste, to feel the warmth of another person, the gentle breeze, the warm sunlight on his skin. Even pain would be preferable to this dry, lifeless skeleton. He corrected himself, admitting that numbness was better than pain, mocking his own nonsense. Yet he missed sensation deeply. When he had his senses, he had never thought much of them, but now their absence chilled him to the bone. He acknowledged why necromancy was scorned as forbidden and taboo. There was no joy in living anymore, no spark to carry him through existence. Yet the thought of ending it all did not appeal to him. He remained afraid of dying. He had thought that losing sensation would erase his fear of death, but it did not. What he truly wanted was to enjoy life, not find peace by forgetting everything in death. All he could do was sigh. He glanced behind his throne at a towering, blood-red obelisk flickering with an eerie light. His ethereal gaze, formed from spirit energy in the hollow eye sockets of his skull, flashed with intent. He believed that if it succeeded, there might still be hope. In a long corridor cloaked in shadow, a towering knight nearly 2 meters tall strode forward. Though he appeared human at a glance, he was not. Pale skin stretched over thick muscles without warmth. He neither breathed nor blinked, undeniable signs of the dead. He was the second in command in the Empire of the Dead, Necropia. This warrior had defeated 3 of the 4 great martial kings, risen as the strongest on earth, and become supreme commander of the Legion of Death. He had been Karnak's loyal servant when the monarch was still human before encountering necromancy. The Death Knight Lord Varos suddenly turned around. Behind him followed another Death Knight, robust but lean in comparison. Varos asked why Karnak had suddenly called for him. Laven, the other Death Knight, replied politely that he could not fathom the monarch's profound intentions. Varos gave a wry smile, remarking that Laven always gave the same response and that he had been better off when alive. Laven Strauss, once one of the 4 great martial kings and the pinnacle of all swordsmen, bowed respectfully again, stating that everything unfolded according to Karnak's will. Varos remarked that Laven was no longer the same person he had been before and left him behind as he continued walking. Finally, Varos reached the entrance of a grand hall, entered, knelt, and addressed Karnak reverently as the Lord of all the dead, the master of life and death, the conqueror of the continent, and the great monarch of death. Karnak, seated on the throne, waved him off quickly, dismissing the formalities. Varos expressed surprise at Karnak's casual attitude toward respect, but Karnak questioned the point of such formalities, asserting that no one would dare disrespect him regardless. Varos reflected that those with absolute power often disregarded decorum since they could impose etiquette instantly, yet he had maintained formalities out of respect for the undead's lingering customs. Karnak's dismissal of formalities suggested there was no longer a need to command the undead. Varos hesitated, then addressed Karnak by the familiar title he had used since Karnak's human days, asking if he had succeeded. Karnak shrugged with a triumphant smile, affirming that he believed it worked. Varos glanced skeptically at the towering blood-red obelisk behind the throne and questioned whether it was truly working this time, noting Karnak's previous failures. Karnak had not always lamented the loss of his mortal body. Conquering the world and bringing all under his control had once given him immense satisfaction, though it lasted only a few years. He questioned the meaning of conquering the world with absolute power if he could not experience pleasure. Unlike many high-ranking undead such as liches, who developed sadistic tendencies to derive satisfaction from others' suffering, Karnak lacked such inclinations. He explained that someone else's pain was just their pain and could not bring him happiness, denying that he was a sociopathic, empathy-devoid maniac. Varos challenged this claim, citing Karnak's past deeds, to which Karnak retorted that he had merely been scrambling to survive. Karnak had attempted numerous methods to regain sensation, beginning with possession, capturing living humans, erasing their souls, and attempting to inhabit their bodies, but his vast spiritual energy crushed them before full. He then tried reincarnation by selecting infants to find a body compatible with his soul, managing to partially inhabit them but never fully. Other methods included stealing sensations and exploring undead pleasures, but all failed. While wraiths and vampires derived pleasure from absorbing souls or blood, their pleasure was also their weakness, filling a missing part of themselves. As the ultimate transcendent being, Karnak had nothing missing and thus no pleasure to fill. Sparing over a lifeless existence without enjoyment, Karnak realized the cause was his transcendental state and resolved to stop being Astra Shunaf. He researched ways to strip away his powers and found that returning to his human past was the answer. He intended to turn back time to when he was human, not the enemy of the world, not hated by the living, but a low-born noble's illegitimate child harboring vague resentment. The blood-red obelisk behind his throne was the manifestation of darkness capable of transcending time and space, born from his desperate research. Karnak declared that if this failed, no one else could ever succeed. Varos snorted, remarking that Karnak was the only proper necromancer in recorded history and needed no comparison to claim the title of strongest. Karnak admitted the point and clicked his jaw in irritation. He threatened to cut off Varos's head if he had not been loyal since childhood. Varos replied that cutting off his head would bring Karnak no peace, explaining his cheekiness. Karnak muttered about Varos's mouth and rose from his throne, approaching the obelisk. Varos stepped forward as well, scrutinizing the crimson surface and asking when exactly they would return to in time, whether they would start from infancy. Karnak explained that the magic required continuity and a connection to the time they arrived in. He nostalgically said they would likely return to the moment he first embraced necromancy, the first time he seized the power of darkness. Varos asked if he would return to when he became a Death Knight, noting their timelines did not match. Karnak reminded him that Varos was merely riding along and would return to the same timeline as him. Varos acknowledged this but remained skeptical, then asked what would happen if the plan failed. Karnak answered that they would cease to exist. Varos found the phrase unsettling and questioned Karnak's casualness. Karnak asked if Varos had lingering attachments to life. Varos laughed hollowly, stating he did not, despite being second in command of the Empire, possessing an immortal body and superhuman power. Indeed, Varos found no pleasure in this life. Karnak remarked that they had nothing to lose. With a calm expression, Varos placed his hand on the obelisk and told Karnak to proceed. Karnak placed his bony hand on the blood-red obelisk as well, which began to emit immense darkness. Karnak declared declared they were going back to the time when they lived as humans. When Karnak opened his eyes, he saw a blond man in his 20s with a rather unassuming look. He wondered who the man was, finding him somewhat familiar, until a familiar voice called out, asking if he was the young master. Karnak then recognized the young man as Varos, his loyal servant in his younger form before becoming a Death Knight. Varos expressed confusion, saying this felt different than he had expected. Karnak acknowledged the disorientation and agreed it was surprising how everything had changed instantly. Karnak requested a mirror to check his appearance, but Varos replied that such a luxury would be unlikely at this point. Instead, Varos scrutinized Karnak's face and assured him he looked exactly as he did at 20, thin and scrawny, with black hair, black eyes, and a perpetually arrogant expression. Varos teased Karnak about his harsh expression, saying he had told him to soften up, but he looked as if he held an eternal grudge against the world. Karnak smiled, noting that some things had not changed, and Varos remained as insufferable as ever. Karnak reflected that he had many grievances against the world when he was young. He stood in a dimly lit cave where a small table held an open book. Karnak picked up the book, recognizing it as the beginning of everything, a crude notebook with messy handwriting, the personal jotting from which he first gained knowledge of necromancy. Karnak snapped his fingers, igniting a tiny flame that consumed the manuscript, turning it to ashes. He explained that this was the extent of his necromancy at this point and that he had memorized everything anyway. Varos, shocked, asked if it was okay to burn the book. Karnak replied that it contained only basic necromancy and no special power, and burning it prevented others from using it and possibly getting him in trouble. Brushing off the ashes, Karnak looked toward the cave's exit where a faint glow appeared and suggested they head outside. Suddenly, Karnak screamed as a massive flood of light poured down on them from above, a blazing brightness threatening to set the world on fire. Varos murmured that he recognized it as sunlight. Karnak agreed and noted that this was what the sun was really like. Their eyes adjusted and they saw the world clearly. No longer undead but fully human, the sunlight no longer felt like hellfire but was warm and comforting. They marveled at the sensations, the warmth of sunlight, the smell of grass and earth. Overwhelmed, they shed tears of pure emotion and were moved by their ability to cry. Karnak exclaimed that he was crying real tears, and Varos noted he was even producing snot and saliva. Karnak joked he might even be able to urinate, and Varos confirmed they were human again. Karnak urged to stop with the gross details. They acknowledged that regaining their true bodies meant losing absolute power. They were no longer the strongest necromancer or the most formidable Death Knight in history. Karnak dismissed the lost power, saying it didn't bring happiness. He called to Varos to live like real people this time. Later, two men walked along a path in a small forest on a mountain, bathed in warm summer sunlight filtering through green trees. Both wore plain, slightly shabby travel clothes. The blond young man raised his hand to shield his eyes and commented on the nice weather. The black-haired young man replied absently, agreeing it was really nice weather. The sun blazed, and the sand sparkled on the fresh, warm day. The blond man remarked that it was a bit too hot, and the black-haired man agreed, complaining about the sweat and the irritating sensations of mortal life. Karnak sighed deeply, reflecting on how living in a mortal body was a hassle. It had been half a day since they left the cave and hit the road. Now hot, irritated, hungry, thirsty, and exasperated, their initial excitement had faded, and they found themselves longing for their former powers again. Karnak noted how fickle human hearts could be. Varos grumbled that there was no turning back and that he would have to get used to it. He unfolded a map and said they should be approaching the village of Dara by now, scratching his head while comparing the map to the surrounding terrain. They had traveled back over 100 years, which explained why Karnak could not remember much from that time. Varos asked if there was a tavern in the village, noting it was a roadside settlement. Karnak confirmed that his younger self had chosen this spot for that reason. They had arrived at the time when Karnak had secretly left his family to master necromancy, hiding in a cave in a remote forest for several months to begin his dark magic studies. Karnak estimated that, judging by his current level of magic, it had been a couple of months since he first gained necromantic power. Varos clarified that this was not the exact moment Karnak first tapped into necromancy, but Karnak explained that a small discrepancy was natural given they were crossing over a century of time. They still needed food while mastering necromancy, but in such a desolate place, finding services was difficult. That was why Karnak had specifically chosen a cave near Dara village, a trade village on the central trade route of the Kingdom of Eustal, equipped with inns, taverns, and shops catering to traveling merchants. Karnak often sent Varos there to fetch necessities. Varos murmured that he thought he remembered that and suddenly asked if they could now enjoy rich wine and juicy beef. Karnak responded with a sad expression, stating that a small village like Dara would not have such high-end fare, and even if it did, they could not afford it. Karnak added that they had no money, and Varos lifted a small coin pouch at his waist, noting it contained only small small change. At this point in time, Karnak did not have access to higher value currency like silver coins, and gold coins were only glimpsed from a distance. Karnak sighed heavily, lamenting the point of coming from a noble family that was completely bankrupt. He recalled vividly scraping together what little he had saved for this secret journey, even though it was a memory from 100 years ago. Karnak reflected that this was why he had been so desperate to learn necromancy, and it finally felt real to come back to this place. As he walked, he reminisced about the past and wondered if he would have to face his parents and two brothers again, expressing reluctance. Varos grimaced in agreement. Karnak's family had been destitute and especially harsh toward him as the despised illegitimate child. His two brothers had heaped scorn on him, treating him with disdain, and young Karnak had resented them. Varos worried if Karnak would pick a fight with his brothers upon seeing them, but Karnak assured him he would flatter them and keep his head down this time. Varos pointed out that this was exactly what Karnak had been unable to do back then. Karnak chuckled dryly, recalling how he had brought ruin to his family, killed his brothers, and committed countless other sins. Now, he claimed he could manage it, having matured beyond the reckless 20-year-old he once was. Varos countered that Karnak was exactly that reckless 20-year-old right now, but Karnak tapped his head and said he was over 100 years old in here. Karnak admitted that his youthful pride had driven him to act out back then, unable to endure their contempt, but now he was sure he could let it slide. He reflected that his brothers had not been that harsh after all, behaving like any other miserable humans who took their frustrations out on him. Then, he reconsidered and admitted he was kind of angry about their treatment. Varos teased that Karnak's temper had not gone anywhere, and Karnak laughed it off. Karnak waved his hand and continued walking along the mountain path, focusing on their current worry of finding a meal rather than their distant family estate. Varos asked what they should do about money, suggesting they might relieve someone on the road of their possessions. Karnak reminded him they were supposed to be living like decent people now. Varos joked that robbery was a habit for Karnak, who retorted that Varos had killed more people than he had. Varos pointed out that Karnak was the one who revived them. Their banter blended jokes and truths as they emerged from the forest into a field where the village of Dara appeared faintly on the horizon. Karnak suggested finding something to eat first and thinking about the rest later. Varos's face brightened at this, agreeing enthusiastically. They still needed to save money for their journey home but could afford at least one meal. At the outskirts of Dara, a few merchants ate lunch on the ground floor of a small inn, though only a few focused solely on their meal. Two unusual men were making quite a scene. They had ordered only a couple of barley loaves and a bowl of stew but gazed at it with reverence, erupting in exclamations with each bite as if performing a sacred ritual. The other patrons whispered about the men's bizarre display, questioning their sanity and hunger. Two young men's behavior continued despite the whispers. The innkeeper brought 2 mugs of ale, which made them tear up. One exclaimed, "Alcohol," while the other said he might faint just from smelling it. Ale was not legendary but leftover from the local brewery, as higher quality ale had been sent to the lord's estate. After taking large swigs, they reacted with ridiculous ecstasy. One declared he would lay down his life for such a taste, and the other reminded him he already had. The other patrons concluded the men were pathetic lunatics and chose to ignore them. Karnak and Varos, however, were blissfully content, having gone decades without tasting food, and each bite felt like the pinnacle of pleasure. Suddenly, a deliciously fragrant chicken stew was set down on the neighboring table, its irresistible aroma filling the air. Varos exclaimed in surprise that they served chicken here, wondering if it was a high-class place after all. In a bustling trade village like this, pork or beef were rare sights, typically reserved for festivals and hard to come by even with money. Chickens were more affordable since they could be raised in backyards and butchered regularly, though not exactly cheap. The fact that they could buy chickens suggested the village was well off with steady traffic. That was, of course, if they had the money. Karnak and Varos whispered to each other, imagining sipping ale alongside the chicken stew and wondering about its cost. Judging by the diner's clothes, the travelers at the neighboring table were probably wealthy. Karnak's eyes gleamed as he proposed killing them to take the food, but Varos reminded him they were trying to live like normal humans. Still, Varos pointed out coldly they lacked the strength to kill everyone and would be beaten easily. Defeated, Varos reached for his coin pouch to pay, lamenting their lack of money. Suddenly, Varos's eyes widened as he noticed something strange. He pulled his hand from the pouch, revealing a silver coin glinting between his fingers, quickly shoved it back and whispered that there was more silver than copper inside. Karnak peered inside and confirmed it. More than half the coins were silver. They exchanged disbelief, questioning how the pouch's contents could have changed when the family crest was still embossed on it. They speculated about how much money they had brought back then, recalling they had been so poor they had to be frugal. That this much silver was impossible. Karnak felt a chill, realizing having so much money was a sign something was wrong. He questioned whether the time magic had worked correctly. Varos asked if this meant they could afford the chicken, and Karnak boldly declared they should eat first and think later, calling to order their meal. Bit into juicy chicken and drank ale, laughing and reveling in pure bliss. Varos leaned back, sighing contentedly, while Karnak murmured about the exquisite happiness, a pleasure worth more than all their past power and glory. But Karnak soon straightened up, turning his gaze toward the coin pouch, determined to figure out what was happening. Varos suggested they might be misremembering, but Karnak argued it was impossible to confuse so many silver coins for copper. They debated whether something had gone wrong with the time reversal magic, but Karnak dismissed the idea of a time-space distortion swapping coins. Varos retorted that figuring it out was Karnak's job, not his. Karnak fell silent, chastened. Varos gently proposed returning to the main estate to make sense of things. Karnak agreed but dreaded the exhausting 3-day walk from Dara to the Zestrad estate. Varos then hesitated and recalled that since this was a relay village, they could rent horses to ease the journey. Renting horses was expensive but feasible between relay stations. Karnak sighed, questioning why they had so much money, but Varos argued that holding back wouldn't solve anything. He insisted they spend the money and worry along the way, ensuring comfort for a clear mind. Karnak blinked, finding Varos surprisingly persuasive. After their meal, Karnak and Varos headed to the western relay station in Dara village, a 2-story wooden building with a large stable. As they approached, a middle-aged man greeted them warmly, surprised to see them return. The man said he had been caring for the horses they had left in his charge, causing Karnak and Varos to freeze, bewildered by the implication they had been here before. The man led them to the stable where about a dozen horses were tied up. 2 brown stallions neighed excitedly as Karnak and Varos approached. The man chuckled warmly while patting the horses, remarking that they seemed delighted to see their masters again. Karnak and Varos exchanged awkward smiles, noting how pleased the horses appeared, as if recognizing them despite it being their first encounter. The man handed over the reins and explained that, as requested, he had fed the horses top-quality fodder mixed with beans, leaving them bursting with energy. His polite, almost obsequious tone carried an expectant look, prompting Varos to glance at Karnak and suggest the man was hoping for a tip. Karnak agreed, and Varos adopted a haughty air as he pulled out a silver coin and handed it over, calling it a small token of appreciation from their young master. The man accepted the coin with gratitude and bowed deeply, promising to fetch the saddles they had left behind. As he hurried back to the building, Karnak muttered in surprise at the phrase, "as always," and Varos explained that it sounded like they used to tip him regularly, even with silver coins. Both men were at a loss, recognizing this as typical behavior of a clueless young noble with more money than sense. Varos admitted growing worry, and Karnak silently resolved to get home as soon as possible, noting that many details matched his memories yet others did not. Meanwhile, Varos, lost in thought, tried to name the horses, only to realize the absurdity of talking to them. Scene shifted to the Zestrad barony, the estate of Karnak's family, a modest noble household in the Eustal kingdom with about 100 years of history. Karnak reflected on the family's ordinariness and the land's mediocrity, which yielded just enough for a modest life. His grandfather, Baron Grelid, had been dissatisfied with their rural stagnation and mortgaged the estate to pursue various ventures, all of which ended in failure, leaving behind only debt before his death. Karnak's father, Baron Kraput, inherited a barren estate and a crumbling manor, striving to revive the family despite the debt. Karnak's elder brother showed promise as heir, and the second son became a respectable knight, helping the family hold on. Karnak mused that his father's high opinions of his son's talents were likely inflated, as both were average by ordinary standards. Baron Kraput lived as a proper noble, taking a mistress who became pregnant and was brought into the household but later abandoned, leading to Karnak's mother's suffering and eventual death. As an illegitimate child, Karnak endured scorn and humiliation, memories that still angered him. He pocketed a silver coin and wondered aloud where all the money had come from. Thanks to the horses, the journey from Dara to the Zestrad estate, which would have taken 3 days on foot, was reduced to 2. Varos grumbled about the horses tiring quickly despite being well fed, while Karnak scoffed, explaining that this was what sturdy, living horses were like. Varos compared them to the undead mounts he had ridden before, which never tired or needed feeding but came with the fatal drawback of death energy saturation. He shrugged, noting that since they were already dead, it didn't matter. Approaching their destination, Varos peered down from a hilltop and spotted the estate. Karnak bitterly smiled at the green barley fields, recalling the place held no good memories despite a sense of nostalgia. Varos expressed irritation, recalling his own troubled past as an orphan at the estate due to his parents' crimes and abandonment. The villagers' prejudice and the estate's lack of welfare facilities had left him destitute until Karnak, despite being an illegitimate noble, insisted on taking Varos as his servant. Baron Kraput approved, seeing Varos as a convenient servant. Karnak reminded Varos that he had been the only one to care for him, while Varos Varos retorted that he had cared for Karnak as well. As the horses trotted steadily toward the estate, they observed farmers busy with weeding in the fields. Karnak and Varos agreed to hurry past to avoid unpleasant reactions from the villagers, as Karnak was known as the unruly youngest son of the lord and Varos as his troublesome servant. However, the villagers spotted them and called out joyfully, some tearing up and expressing relief at their return, acknowledging that they must have endured much. As the horses trotted steadily toward the estate, the farmers were busy weeding in the fields. Karnak and Varos agreed to hurry past to avoid unpleasant reactions from the villagers, as Karnak was known as the unruly youngest son of the lord and Varos as his troublesome servant. However, the villagers spotted them and called out joyfully, some tearing up and expressing relief at their return, acknowledging the hardships they must have endured. Their reactions were far from what Karnak remembered. He let out a hollow laugh, questioning what he had ever done to deserve being called hardworking. Given how naturally everyone greeted him, he refrained from asking why they were so happy to see him, sensing it would be out of place. Instead, he raised his hands in a quick wave, nudged his horse forward, and swiftly rode away. Varos frowned while glancing over his shoulder, murmuring that it felt like being trapped in a nightmare. Karnak agreed, insisting they needed to get home as soon as possible. Standing before a large stone wall, Varos muttered in confusion, asking what it was. Karnak scowled, his face contorting in disbelief, admitting he had no idea what was happening anymore. Before them stood a grand estate with high-quality brick walls stretching in both directions, an elegant garden beyond, and a stunning two-story mansion rising above it, complete with a sunlit terrace and gleaming statues. Karnak confirmed it was the Zestrad estate, though bewildered by its immaculate condition. The wall's height remained the same, the garden's size was unchanged, and the building itself was still there, but the mansion was spotless and completely renovated. The Zestrad manor, he remembered, was over 100 years old, run down, and neglected for decades due to lack of funds. Now, every corner was impeccably maintained, exuding noble grandeur, the image of a distinguished noble estate from a storybook. Varos asked where they were, expressing shared confusion about the world itself. Karnak suggested going inside for now, though Varos hesitated, noting their shabby appearance might not fit such a fine place. Approaching the main gate with a wary glance, a gatekeeper noticed them and greeted Karnak with a bright expression. The man, Katail, appeared to be in his mid-40s and a familiar face from Karnak's memories. Karnak nodded, feigning nonchalance, and said he was back. Katail immediately instructed another gatekeeper to inform the steward that the young master had returned, which was done promptly. Karnak sighed as he watched familiar faces rush to greet him. The situation aligned with his recollections, but the appearance of everything was entirely different. The mansion gleamed with polish, the servants' clothing was immaculate, and their warm greetings were unlike the disdainful glances and cold treatment he remembered. Varos whispered to Karnak that nothing could surprise him anymore, and Karnak agreed. Yet their assumptions were soon shattered when a well-dressed elderly man with a dignified air hurried out of the mansion. Karnak recognized him as Tafel Flade, the elderly butler who had served since his grandfather's time. The gatekeeper called out that the young master had returned, but Tafel gave him a sharp look and chastised him for continuing to call Karnak young master. Then, with a gentle expression Karnak had never seen before, Tafel bowed respectfully and welcomed him home, addressing him as my lord. Karnak and Varos blinked in astonishment, questioning if Tafel, inside an opulent drawing room adorned with elegant paintings and decorations, a delicate teacup on the table released gentle wisps of steam. Karnak wore a dazed expression as he stared at the cup, noting he had never touched such a luxury item before. Varos tried to hide his own bewilderment. Tafel spoke quietly, informing Karnak that it had been over half a year since he had taken on the role of family head. Karnak gathered that he had inherited the barony right after coming of age, around 20 years old. Tafel asked if he had accomplished what he set out to do. Karnak repeated the question reflexively, confused. Tafel clarified he meant the purpose of his travels, which Karnak admitted was more or less. Tafel expressed that the late lord would be pleased. Karnak was bewildered to learn his father was dead. Tafel continued, saying that if Lady Isabella, Karnak's stepmother, were still alive, she would be proud. Karnak realized she was dead too. Tafel added that when Sir Tezel passed as well, he had wondered how they would manage, but now he could be at ease. Karnak deduced that his eldest brother was also dead. His curiosity piqued. Karnak wondered about Paralt, his second brother, whom he disparaged silently. It was clear Paralt was not alive. Otherwise, Karnak would not have received the title of lord. He longed to know what had happened but could not ask. He also had no clue what the purpose of his journey was supposed to be. If he had a reason for traveling, it was obvious, mastering necromancy in secret after acquiring it by chance. Any other purpose made no sense, especially since he was actively studying necromancy even now. But he would never openly admit that, knowing the consequences would be dire. Karnak wondered what old man Tafel thought thought his purpose was. Another question weighed on his mind. Originally, Karnak's reason for learning necromancy had been revenge, to gain power and strike back at his family. Judging by the current situation, that revenge seemed unnecessary. He was the lord of the estate, acknowledged by those around him, treated with kindness. He had no idea why he would bother with necromancy if he was living so comfortably. Without his power intact, he could not use mind control to gather information. Realizing he couldn't continue this way, Karnak gave Varos a subtle look to intervene. After over a century of practice, they understood each other perfectly. Varos stepped into the conversation, addressing Tafel and suggesting that Lord Karnak was weary from his long travels and that it might be best to continue the conversation tomorrow. Tafel clicked his tongue, apologized for his lack of consideration, rose from his seat, and urged Karnak to rest for now. Karnak agreed. Karnak breathed a silent sigh of relief as he rose from his seat, feeling as if he had just escaped walking on thin ice. He glanced at Varos, who nodded in agreement and urged to leave immediately.